So one thing that we wanted to talk about today is obviously there is a big topic of conversation at the moment, and it's the coronavirus, right? And there has been an announcement by Air New Zealand that actually showcase what kind of international flight they're going to be running in September and October. And I think that despite the fact it's not an official government announcement or anything like that, it gives a good understanding into where is New Zealand at when it comes to international connection for the foreseeable 2 months. So we'll go over that and we'll give you a little bit of understanding about our train of thought as well when we did our videos with prediction of the border openings.
Yeah, so currently, as it stands right now, the borders are closed to New Zealand to all international travellers, except for a very few amount of people. Usually it's New Zealand citizens or residents returning back from another country that are allowed back into New Zealand, or essential workers. So you have to meet a very specific criteria to come to New Zealand, and that's basically what it is. Otherwise, basically to the rest of the world, the borders are closed. And when people do arrive back in New Zealand at the moment, they have to stay in an isolation or quarantine facility, which these are actually not as scary as they sound. They're actually just hotels that are currently being sort of managed by the government. So you actually get to stay in a hotel for a couple of weeks or minimum of 14 days, and you get a couple of tests for the coronavirus while you are in quarantine, and that basically determines whether you can be let out into the community after your 14 days or not. So that's currently what it's like in New Zealand with the state of coronavirus right now.
So once you get out of isolation, then you kind of are free to basically do pretty much what you want. As we mentioned at the beginning of our live session today, we kind of enjoy kind of a mask-free lifestyle at the moment in New Zealand. Yeah. But going back to the topic at hand, Air New Zealand, I'm just referring to my notes right here. So Air New Zealand has announced their schedule for international travel from the 1st of September to the 24th of October. And you will notice that there is really not that many flights. And we'll group them a little bit into kind of which areas they're going to. And that will help you understand how many people are expected to be coming to New Zealand. And that's also why we had so many pessimistic predictions about when will the border opens of New Zealand. What we were telling you guys, don't plan to come in 2021. And I'll go a bit more in depth afterwards. But again, this is just an announcement from Air New Zealand. It's nothing official, and we are just extrapolating some speculation based on some information. So I just really want to make sure that you guys are not taking this as a fake news and going to run with it and planning all your life plans. With that, it is just some speculation based on some information we received. So first up, we're going to be talking about some connection with Australia. So with Australia, Auckland to Sydney is going to be running 9 times per week. Auckland to Brisbane is going to be running 4 times per week. Auckland to Melbourne will be running 7 times per week. And there is not going to be any other kind of schedule. So Air New Zealand is only going to be servicing 3 cities, which are going to be Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. And that's only going to be a total of 20 flights. So that's only 20 flights per week. It's very, very, very low. It's less than a tenth of what they usually run. It's usually a very, very busy route. And it's expected that most of the planes are going to be quite empty. Those are really just the basic services. And again, since, as Laura mentioned, the borders are closed, it's literally just for Kiwis kind of returning home, which are willing to put up with all the quarantine, with all the quarantine, and also for essential workers. So, some health workers or anything like that. So you have to know that it's really... there's really some tight control in there. Now, New Zealand also has a lot of connections with the South Pacific Islands. We kind of mostly are a big hub for the South Pacific Islands, more so than Australia. I mean, Australia is also a big hub to travel to the South Pacific Island, but New Zealand is very, very well connected to the South Pacific Island and has hundreds and hundreds of flights to the South Pacific usually. Now, here's what flights are going to be scheduled. So between Auckland, Rarotonga, Fiji, Samoa and Tonga, that's 1 flight per week. So that's one flight per week to each of those markets. So that's one flight to Fiji, one flight to Rarotonga, which is the Cook Islands, one flight to Samoa, and one flight to Tonga. For Niue, there's going to be one flight per week. For the Norfolk Islands, Air New Zealand is going to run a Sydney to Norfolk Island twice per week, Brisbane to Norfolk Island twice per week, and all other services will be cancelled. Now, that shows you that even with markets which are mostly COVID-19 free, right? There is really no outbreak in the South Pacific. There is a couple of cases in Fiji. There is some few cases in French Polynesia, but it's not even on the list. But even to markets in Tonga, which is COVID-19 free, and Niue, which is COVID-19 free, the flights are drastically reduced. So you've got to be aware that this is kind of a really unusual situation right here, and that shows you that even where there is places which have already eradicated COVID-19, there is not even a return to normal. So same thing, people that are coming from those places in the world, they still have to do all the quarantine and those kind of things. So there is going to be very few amount of people in the planes. Now, one thing to keep in mind as well is that the situation may change. I wouldn't be putting past Air New Zealand to actually increase flight if some travels will be allowed. There are a lot of talk right now with the bubble, talking about a bubble between the Cook Islands and New Zealand as well, between Niue and New Zealand as well. So there's a lot of talk with that. That means that if the market open, and that will take a couple of weeks at least, even more probably, but if the markets open, then at this point free travel will be allowed, and at this point Air New Zealand will try to recoup some cost of it, this best operating cost, and they're going to start doing a lot of flight there. So this may change as well, but that's right now what they're forecasting. And finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about long-haul flights, so that may pertain to you guys a little bit more, which is flights which are more international. So again, we don't really consider like Australia as international just because it's just so close. But longer-haul flight, here's what Air New Zealand has planned between the 1st of September and the 24th of October. So between Auckland and Los Angeles, they're going to do one flight daily, so one flight per day. Between Auckland and San Francisco, they're going to do 3 flights per week. Between Auckland and Hong Kong, they're going to do 3 flights per week. Between Auckland and Seoul, they're going to do 1 flight per month. That is it. Between Auckland and Narita, that's 1 flight per week. Between Auckland and Shanghai, that's 1 flight per week. And between actually, there's a note that says Auckland to Shanghai are already fully sold out for travel until the end of September. So there is obviously demand of people trying to get their family back together. But yeah, even if some flights are sold out, they're still not putting much more flights on top of that, just also because there is some issues with capacities of quarantine. So when you actually have to put people in quarantine when they arrive in New Zealand, you need to have enough quarantine facilities for that. And that's also an issue that New Zealand may encounter. So they're working very closely with Air New Zealand in order to organize that. Now, there are some preparations which are put in place in some airports. So for example, the Auckland airport have just concluded kind of a big reshuffle around the whole airport, and they're divided in 2 halves, with one kind of safe zone travel for both domestic travels as well as like kind of travel to like the Cook Island and places like that when they reopen. And you also have one at-risk travel, so like kind of a zone 2 for passengers that have to be screened, put into quarantine and do all that. So there is going to be absolutely no contact between those 2 zones. So even the airport won't be a hotbed or something very disorganized in which the virus will be able to spread. So there is a lot of work which are put in place in order to kind of slowly reopen market by market. But as you can see, even with places which have already eradicated COVID-19, well, there is, until the end of October, there is not much of an interest by the airline to run flights. So that really shows you that the reopening of the border is going to be extremely slow. And that's why when we did our prediction and we went through every single countries, and we were telling that most of the countries are not going to open until January or February next year, this is kind of the information that we're taking in consideration. Because there is one more thing to keep in mind, is that even if the markets reopen, it still takes at least a week or 2 for an airline to reschedule flights to a place. It's not that fast, especially since in the airline industry, usually when you get slots allocated or routes allocated, let's say between Auckland and San Francisco, for instance. If you don't fly that route, you kind of lose it, and then other airline can take it. And obviously, there has been a lot of amendment to those kind of rules due to COVID-19 because it's unprecedented. But that's kind of like what the rule is. So there is still quite a lot of paperwork involved to just open a new route to somewhere else. It is obviously going to be sped up because right now they really want to re-kickstart the tourism economy, but it still does take a little bit of time to get that ball rolling again. So since right now we looked at the schedule until the end of October, then that just leaves us in this November and December. By the time they rework extra routes and everything like that, if the markets reopen, that really leaves you very little amount of travels to be done in 2020. So for this reason, most of our predictions were pushed all the way to 2021 and actually all the way to beginning to mid 2021 for reopening. And that is if the virus is under control in your country as well, because I think that's something which is very important as well to keep in mind. It's not just up to New Zealand to kind of keep COVID-19 free. If you want the border to be open with your country, well, you need to have it under control as well, because New Zealand is not going to take a risk of reopening the borders to a country that has like kind of rampant community transmission. All right, so I hope that this understanding and this extra tidbits of information was useful to you. I know that it was just a little bit of information and it was full of speculation in the middle of all of it, and I really want you guys to keep that in mind. Those were just mostly speculation. There was some information that we received, but mostly speculation. So please don't take that as news. Don't plan your trip around that, but just get an understanding about the current situation and why we made our prediction and how. If you did find this video useful, you can hit the like button. It's always a free way to say thank you for all our hard work. And if you hit subscribe, you'll get much more news about traveling in New Zealand, also all our tips and all the awesome things to do. So here you go. Thank you for watching. All right, let's go back to the live chat.